open a language map of South America, almost the entire continent speaks Spanish. One country doesn't, and it's the biggest one. The border between Spanish-speaking and Portuguese-speaking South America isn't a mountain range or a river. It follows an almost perfect north-south line. That line is a treaty, signed on June 7, 1494, in a small Spanish town called Tordesillas. Two countries drew a line through a world they'd never mapped. The standard answer is, that's why Brazil speaks Portuguese. A treaty drew a line, Portugal got the east, done. That answer is incomplete, because in 1494, nobody could actually measure where that line was, because most of modern Brazil sits on the wrong side of it, and because for 2 centuries the people living there didn't speak Portuguese at all, until a government decree in 1757 forced them to. Here's what actually happened. It started with a wind pattern, and a compromise that accidentally included a continent nobody in Europe knew existed. In 1493, Columbus had just returned from the Caribbean. He'd sailed under the Spanish flag, but Portugal had been exploring the Atlantic for decades. They had trading posts down the African coast and papal bulls from the 1450s that gave them the exclusive rights to new territories south of a certain line. So when Columbus came back claiming new lands for Spain, Portugal objected. Both countries believed they had the legal rights to the same ocean. They needed an arbiter, and in the 15th century, the Pope functioned as the supreme authority in disputes between Christian monarchs. Both Spain and Portugal were Catholic kingdoms. Both accepted papal jurisdiction over territorial claims involving non-Christian lands. So they asked the Pope to draw a line. The Pope at the time was Alexander VI, a Spaniard born Rodrigo Borgia, and the line he drew favored Spain. He placed it 100 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, a Portuguese archipelago off the west coast of Africa. Everything west of that line went to Spain, everything east went to Portugal. Portugal looked at that line and saw a problem. Not just that it wasn't fair, the problem was practical. Portuguese sailors had spent decades mastering the Atlantic winds. They'd mastered a technique called the volta do mar, the turn of the sea. When sailing home from the African coast, they couldn't just head straight north. The trade winds pushed against them, so they swung their ships far west into the open Atlantic, sometimes for weeks, until they caught the westerly winds at higher latitudes. Those winds carried them in a sweeping arc back towards Lisbon. The Cambridge historian Anthony Disney documents this precisely. Portuguese navigators could fix their latitude to within half a degree, but that return arc swung far west. At 100 leagues from Cape Verde, the Pope's line would put Portuguese ships in Spanish waters during routine voyages home from Africa. Not hypothetically, on every single trip. So when Portugal's king, João II, sent diplomats to renegotiate, this wasn't a land grab. The Portuguese Atlantic trade route, their entire commercial lifeline to Africa, depended on having enough sea room to execute that volta do mar. And Portugal had the strongest navy in the Atlantic at the time. Disney notes that João had already demonstrated this by intercepting Spanish ships on the African coast. Spain knew that a deal Portugal rejected was a deal they'd have to enforce by sea, against a navy they couldn't beat. The negotiations happened in Tordesillas, a town in Castile, over several weeks in the spring of 1494. The compromise moved the line to 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. That gave Portugal enough ocean to execute the Volta do Mar safely. And, by accident, it sliced through the easternmost bulge of a continent nobody in Europe knew existed. I tracked down the original treaty text. It's available through Yale's Avalon project. And the part that usually gets left out is this. In 1494, nobody could actually measure where this line was. Portuguese mariners could measure latitude, how far north or south they were. They used the mariner's astrolabe, a handheld instrument for sighting the angle of the sun above the horizon. They cross-referenced those readings with declination tables compiled by Abraham Zacuto, a Jewish astronomer working for the Portuguese crown, which corrected for the sun's seasonal position. That technology worked. But the Tordesillas line runs north to south. That's longitude, how far east or west you are. And in 1494, there was no reliable way to measure longitude at sea. The main methods available, lunar distances, eclipses, dead reckoning, were either too imprecise or too infrequent to be practical on a moving ship. What you really needed was a clock that could keep perfect time on a pitching deck for months. That clock, John Harrison's marine chronometer, wouldn't exist for nearly 250 years. The treaty even acknowledged the problem. It mandated a joint survey. The text specifies 2 or 3 caravels from each side to meet within 10 months and physically locate the line. That survey never happened. They divided the planet using a measurement that didn't exist yet. 6 years later, in 1500, a Portuguese fleet, led by Pedro Álvares Cabral, made landfall on the coast of what is now Brazil. Whether it was accidental or deliberate is still debated. Disney writes that for some years before the voyage began, the Crown already knew, or at least strongly suspected, that a continental landmass to the southwest existed, and that they deliberately kept the matter secret. What isn't debated is that Cabral's landfall fell on the Portuguese side of the line. Portugal claimed it. They built trading posts along the coast. And when French ships started ignoring the treaty and logging Brazil wood, a red dye wood so valuable it gave the territory its name, Portugal responded by establishing permanent settlements to defend the claim. Now, that's the textbook answer. A pope, a wind pattern, and a treaty gave Portugal a foothold on the coast of South America. But look at modern Brazil. It's massive, and most of it sits far west of the Tordesillas line. So how did a coastal foothold become half a continent? In 1580, the Spanish and Portuguese crowns merged under the same king. Philip II of Spain inherited the Portuguese throne. For 60 years, from 1580 to 1640, Spain and Portugal were effectively one kingdom, which meant there was no border to enforce. The Tordesillas line became a dead letter, not formally abolished, just ignored. Portuguese settlers from Sao Paulo, called bandeirantes, pushed west into the interior. They were looking for indigenous slaves, gold, and anything of value. Disney writes that they dressed in part Amerindian, part Portuguese fashion, and spoke Tupi Guarani with their native followings. They weren't exactly representatives of Lisbon's high society, but they covered enormous distances. One expedition led by a Portuguese soldier named Pedro Teixeira traveled from Belém on the Amazon coast all the way to Quito in the Andes in 1637, clear across the continent, far west of that Tordesillas line. Disney notes that the news caused much indignation in Spain's Council of the Indies, but there was nothing Spain could do about it. Both kingdoms still shared the crown. There was no one to complain to, and no border to defend. When the crowns finally separated in 1640, Portugal simply refused to give the land back. Over a century later, in 1750, both sides sat down to sort out the mess. The result was the Treaty of Madrid, a formal agreement to abandon the Tordesillas line entirely and replace it with a new principle, uti possedetis. That's a legal concept meaning you keep what you effectively possess. If your settlers were living there, farming there, building there, the land was yours, regardless of where the old line had been. Disney writes that under this new arrangement, Brazil had acquired far greater territory than that to which it would have been entitled under any reasonable interpretation of the Treaty of Tordesillas. Portugal didn't push the line slightly, they almost doubled the country. The treaty gave Portugal a foothold. 60 years of shared monarchy gave it a continent. But Portugal's control of the territory didn't mean the people living there spoke Portuguese. For roughly 2 centuries, the dominant language in much of colonial Brazil wasn't Portuguese. It was língua geral, a simplified version of Tupi, the language of the indigenous communities along the coast. Colonists adopted it, missionaries taught in it, mixed families raised their children in it. Portuguese was for official documents, for correspondence with Lisbon. On the ground, in the settlements, and in the interior, people spoke Tupi. And the Jesuit missions, which were the largest organized institutions in the colonial interior, ran entirely in indigenous languages. They educated in Tupi. They preached in Tupi. They published grammars and dictionaries of Tupi. For the Jesuits, speaking the local language wasn't optional. It was their method of conversion. So, what changed? In the 1750s, Portugal's most powerful minister, the Marquis of Pombal, essentially the prime minister under King Jose I, looked at the colonial interior and saw a problem. The Jesuits controlled the largest network of settlements in Brazil. They ran indigenous villages, managed labor, and operated almost independently of the crown. And they did it all in a language Lisbon couldn't understand. Disney writes that Pombal concluded, "The presence of the Jesuits in Brazil constituted a fundamental challenge to Portuguese sovereignty." So Pombal acted. The 1757 Territorio dos Indies, the Indian Directorate, stripped the Jesuits of their control over indigenous villages, replaced them with secular government directors, and mandated that Portuguese be taught in every settlement. 2 years later, in 1759, Pombal expelled the Jesuits from all Portuguese territories entirely. Portuguese didn't spread naturally. It was imposed by decree. And without that decree, Brazil might still speak a Tupi language today. So the real answer to why does Brazil speak Portuguese isn't just the Treaty of Tordesillas. It's a wind pattern that forced ships west, a papal line that favored Spain, a compromise that accidentally included a continent, 60 years of shared monarchy that turned the coastal strip into half of South America, and the government minister in 1757 who killed the language people actually spoke. That treaty line left marks that go beyond language. In 2023, economists Humberto Lodares and Felipe Valencia Caicedo published a study in the Journal of Development Economics. They took the Tordesillas meridian, the old treaty line, and mapped it against 2010 Brazilian census data. What they found is that income inequality is measurably higher on the Portuguese side of that line than on the Spanish side. A boundary drawn in 1494 by men who couldn't measure where it was still shows up in economic data more than 500 years later. I'm working on a full deep dive on the treaty itself, what it says, what it doesn't, and why it still matters. If you found this useful, please subscribe.